So that video does a really good job highlighting how the communist philosophy actually takes place in real life. All of it was based on revolting over whoever was in power before you. And obviously the Bolsheviks were very adamant about taking things from other people, as they took grain from the peasants who were growing it for their war communism. And even if you look at the attempt by the green movement there, the peasants, they're attempting to do the same thing with the Bolsheviks and the communists in power to overthrow them because they're upset at what's going on. And so you continuously see this cycle of certain groups who have power dominating and taking over other groups. And again, people will say, well, that wasn't communism. But if you look at what Karl Marx wrote, essentially it's, well, you're either an oppressor or you're oppressed. You can't be something else in between. You can't just be a group of people that had a bad hand dealt to you. And it seems that in practicality, given the way Karl Marx wrote about the way society functions and how individuals and groups are always vying for more and more power, that it's likely that those are the people who are going to be attracted most to that philosophy, that want some degree of authority and control and function. I mean, it's certainly how it played out in many of these countries. Same situation occurred in China as well, right? The communists there, they didn't partake in the World War II effort to fight against the Japanese who were invading them. They waited for the Democratic or whatever government party that was in charge to deal with the Japanese. And when the war was over and the government was weak, that's when the communists stepped in to overthrow the government. Okay. Yes.
Can I go fill my water bottle?
Go ahead. Thanks. So the Bolshevik Communist Party here, they did a wonderful job of coordinating various riots and various movements. It's a grassroots movements, really. They're trying to get a hold of just your everyday people. And their views will oscillate. So Lenin did believe that violence was the solution. Violence would crush the goals of democratic Russia. But as we saw nearing the end of the video, eventually he did initiate some more capitalist ideals into Russian society to get people to be more productive. I don't know what else I want to share about this. Okay, we'll pass on that. This slide just looks more into the conflicts that are going. There's a lot of independence movements happening in this region of the world at this time, at the end of World War I, World War II as well. And many of these people are being pitted against one another. Okay. And the Bolshevik communists were very brutal. They had no problem getting rid of people, using violence, exile, death, assassination to get what they wanted. Okay, so we'll look at we'll do a couple more slides here on Lenin. So he became leader of the Bolsheviks, and his promise to the people was peace, land, and bread. And to peasants and individual citizens who had been at war for several years, had no land, and were starving, this speaks to all of their needs at the time, and is likely to get Lenin some popularity and some votes. By 1917, his supporters in the Bolshevik Party had enough strength and support to take power. Leon Trotsky joins him, and together they successfully establish a new Russian government. Unlike Marx, Lenin believed a communist government was necessary. So again, Karl Marx did write that, well, the workers will revolt and they'll organize things themselves and everyone will do this. But again, there's no real example of how that would even occur. right? So should it be the workers at a particular factory? Should it be workers in general? And even if you do leave people to their own devices, eventually you are going to see certain groups of people who are more effective at leadership and coordination than other people. And clearly Lenin and Trotsky were two of those people who were very effective at coordinating. Okay, Stalin was very brutal, that was his skill set. So, Vladimir Lenin has an attempt taken on his life, and like any good dictator, then proceeds to, attempt to assassinate and kill as many of his rivals. Hitler did the same thing in the late 30s as well. The Night of Long Knives, they call it, amongst other things that he did. And he's trying to essentially solidify his authority and power in Russia at the time, making sure that he has no rivals. Civil war erupts between the people who are against Lenin and this Bolshevik communist uprising and the ones who are for it. And so you have the Bolshevik Red Army. They're going against the anti-Bolshevik White Army. And obviously that group, being more democratic, is supported by other Western democratic nations as well, like the United States, Canada, France, Britain. Additionally, you have to consider that I guess this would be 1920s. Yeah, you got to consider that none of these countries want Russia to become a threat, and they want Russia to be viable, economically viable as well. Okay, and people are aware more or less of this kind of Karl Marx's philosophy of revolution and overthrowing governments. And so you wouldn't want one country that's main goal is to overthrow people in charge of other countries. It's a threat to everyone then. So as last point there were roughly 7 to 15 million casualties from this civil war. Most of these are civilian, which is anywhere from 5.5 to 12% of the population at the time. Okay, all over a conflict over who should lead their country. So, under Lenin in 1922, several republics joined. They create the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That's what the USSR stands for. Okay, so these people get together. They're led by Lenin. Okay. Land was redistributed, stolen people. Also have factories were given to the workers so that they could make decisions about wages and working conditions. Men and women were considered equal and valuable contributors to society because, men and women both have to play a role in ushering in the utopia. Everyone has to go to work. It's very visible in China. Art and music flourished as there were no longer restrictions on what one could create. So for some time under Lenin, many of the poor or working class people did gain more power, more influence. Maybe they saw their lives improve temporarily. There were those that did not feel represented by Lenin or his supporters. Obviously if you had your land redistributed to someone else, maybe you don't feel very supported by that movement. During his rule, so there's political turmoil during his rule, the assassination we already talked about. There's famine, there's violent responses by Lenin. So again, if people do rise up to question what he is doing or his authority, many communist dictators just simply crush any of that opposition through violence. And again, that's their motto, that's their modus operandi. Okay. Lenin dies from a stroke in 1924, and then we have Stalin come into place. Okay. We'll actually just finish up until the documentary point, and then we'll end that for today. So Stalin plays a rather clever game. He knows he's not the most charismatic individual. He's not the most well-spoken. He has a very clever opponent in Leon Trotsky. And so Stalin, ices Trotsky out at the funeral that he organizes for Lenin. Lenin's already suspicious of this guy. You know, he's from a different area, and you know, he's kind of silent, but he's very brutal. He was well known for that before he took over as well, and he was a very useful tool. Anyways, once Lenin is gone and Stalin's, you know, looking to gain power, he has to deal with Trotsky, so he has Trotsky deported after this kind of internal conflict of power and authority and who's going to take over. And then he has Trotsky assassinated in Mexico. As the story goes, they stabbed him in the face with an ice pickaxe. Why an ice pickaxe in Mexico, I'm not sure, but not a very fun way to go. Okay. And Stalin's form of communism rejects liberalism outright, very much. I mean, Lenin's form did as well, but Lenin, being a rather reasonable person, it's very likely that Joseph Stalin was just a psychopath. I mean, he lost his mind towards the end of his life. But anyways, Lenin was at least somewhat, I mean, obviously I would assume he was still psychopathic, but Lenin would at least give in to some of the needs and requests of the people around him. Okay. And Stalin wants absolute control and power, which, you know, the communist system that's been put into place gives him a lot of access to already. Okay. Some of his policies were he created gulags for those who opposed his views. So again, if you didn't agree with the redistribution of land, because let's say you were wealthy and wealth shouldn't exist in this nation, a communist nation, if you disagreed with your stuff being given to other people, well, then you were sent to a work camp, typically in Siberia in the freezing cold. He also had secret police that controlled people through terror and force, so he's constantly spying on his citizenship, people around him. And again, you know, if you play this psychopathic game of power where you are overthrowing the people above you, you're always going to be concerned at when your turn is coming up. And so Stalin is he's very mindful of that, and he's very concerned, and so he takes precautions. Stalin, just like Lenin before him, purges the opposition in 3 years within the Communist Party and the military, so everyone who's left behind is too scared to say no to him and too scared to oppose him, as well as, you know, just either agreeing with him. He rewrites history. This is, again, very common of communist dictatorships overthrowing governments. You know, they'll rewrite their history books. So my friend was saying, when I interviewed him, he said that when his family had to move into my friend's Chinese, so when his family had to move into a government-given house, or shed, really, everyone was then required to go to the town center and to get a photo of Mao, right? And so Mao Zedong in China rewrites their history. Stalin rewrites history for the Russians. He has some rapid and forced industrialization and collectivization of all forms, again, by force if necessary, which usually it is, right? Most people aren't just going to give up their stuff, you know, unless there's some sort of threat. The photo's kind of blurry, but those are in fact dead bodies or decomposed bodies. Anyways, he has this great purge, Stalin. Again, his modus operandus is to take out all of his enemies. Between the years 1934 and 1938, around 10 million people were deported to concentration camps and or executed. That's about 10% of the population. So that would be about 3 kids in this classroom. Okay. People were executed for a variety of reasons. Whether it was during displacement processes, so they just needed people to move from one place to another, or due to the belief that they were being influenced by Western influences. So if these people were being anti-communist against this utopia, if they're being too democratic, you know, they're gone, right? You can't have that kind of resistance in a communist state. Okay. Anyone thought to be against Stalin is dealt violently. And again, the belief system here operates on violence and overthrowing those from before you. And so naturally, when you are in power, you're going to make sure you enforce that as much as you can. In terms of industrialization, Stalin has his 5-year plan. So again, this is all centrally organized, right? This isn't communicated with a lot of other people, and it's not done in a natural natural process. And so some of the challenges that come with his industrialization is that you have this rapid cultural change, which often doesn't work, particularly historically, because information is hard to get across. Nowadays, with access to cell phones and social media, it's very easy to get information across to people. Additionally, the understanding we have now of human psychology and how people function, it's very easy to just put in an algorithm into your application to do certain things. So, Facebook has been under some fire about that. Google as well, for censorship and whatnot. It's very easy to change a culture and a group of people now if you're just using technological systems. Now, human biology takes very long time to change. We're looking at animals as well. So naturally, Stalin is going to face some resistance because he's changing things more quickly than people are willing to go along. Okay. What else do I want to share? Let me just skip ahead and see how many farms we have. Okay, we'll just wrap up with collectivizing farms because there's a couple more slides there. This slide just emphasizes, again, any natural concern that people might have. If you're busy spending time working in a field, growing food, day in and day out, your concern is to make sure that you get enough to eat because you're working very hard. And so Lenin attempts to collectivize the farms and take from peasants, but he's met with a lot of resistance. So is Stalin to an extent. And many of these individuals felt like the government was not offering them enough in return for their services, right? So either whatever food they were growing, they just weren't getting paid by the government enough for it. It's very necessary. This stockpiling caused many millions to go hungry in the cities and forced Lenin to instill a more capitalist policy to keep the economy from crashing. So when the government steps in and intervenes and creates an artificial supply and demand and tries controlling and distributing the food, or any item really, food is very ubiquitous, it creates delays and lags in the economy and the market, which one, they're trying to prevent from crashing, but two, the food doesn't end up where it needs to go naturally. Right, so this food is being distributed in certain areas. Now, Lenin and Stalin both emphasized putting in more food into the cities because that's where the industrialization was happening for the 5-year plans. The only issue with that is if you emphasize feeding the people in the cities, well, what about the people who are growing the food? And typical of Marxist philosophy, the rich peasants, who are the kulaks, they are the ones who are targeted the hardest, and they're the ones who resist the most. Again, they're the ones who have the most to lose. Maybe they've been successfully operating their farm for a few generations, and their family knows how to raise animals, raise food, or grow food rather. So they resist as they should. It's their every right that they have. Eventually, their resistance was dealt with severely, so there's execution involved, forced exile, sent to gulags, forced removal of property. Maybe the government just comes in with the military and redistributes your land, like you no longer own it. Their land redistributed to the middle and lower classes, and the issue with that, because it sounds like a great idea. Like, hey, we have 30 people in this classroom. About, let's say, 3 to 5 of you own the majority of the land and are very wealthy because of it. But what they didn't realize is that the 3 to 5 of you also produce potentially 80% of the food and the results. Okay, that's the Matthew principle, the 80-20 rule. Okay, so the rich peasants weren't exactly rich because they manipulated and used these power games to take from other people. it's very likely that they were rich peasants because they actually knew how to grow food well. You look at the same thing with your skill of art, right? Like, I'm sure there's a lot of people who can draw well, but people who market their ability to do that get more publicity, right? In terms of growing food, it's very similar, right? It's very, very clear who's producing a lot of food. Okay. Anyways, once the land is redistributed and these kulaks are dealt with, this food shortage that is then created results in the deaths of 6 to 7 million people. So if you're following along, we're already looking at about, potentially 20 to 30 million deaths in the last 30 years in Russia. And a lot of this is just, more or less executions from the government onto their own people, civil conflict, or starvation. Okay. We will stop with this today.